my dad that told me, but it's I never really know if it's a taboo subject to talk to about my parents just because they don't necessarily voluntarily share about it all the time. Most of the time, it's either I ask a question about them and then they share. And I don't know if it's just because they don't necessarily like opening up about their private lives, especially because when my dad was immigrating, he was only 12 years old, and that's already a lot to go through. And the next several years of his life of his adolescence was spent trying to unite his family together. So he's never been particularly open or won't necessarily like open a conversation about it. I'm probably because it's a little bit of a downer in a way. But they were able to but my dad was able to share his story to me. I hear about it from like little glimpses when I talk to my mom, but if you meet any Vietnamese and Americans, like I grew up in a Vietnamese church. It's it's just very normal that everyone has a story of how they immigrated, how they managed to escape the communist regime. And for a lot of people who aren't necessarily in the Vietnamese community, it might seem very new to them in a way. But for us, it's almost like, what happened last Saturday? This is what happened. Like it's so common that I think for me, it's just a part of who we are. And so even now, I still find more stories about how my family was involved in the war and how they were able to save themselves from the communist regime. Yeah, so I'll speak about both of my parents' side because my grandfather was a Vietnam general, and I was talking to my mom about it, but she doesn't have much experience of knowing what her dad did because he wasn't really present in the household with her. All I know is that he didn't kill anybody, but he ordered other people to kill people. So when the fall of Saigon did happen, he did have to flee, and he ended up leaving the rest of his family in order to save his own life. And the reason why he was able to escape to America is because his wife, who's my grandmother, well, technically my step grandmother, was residing in America. And if you have any sort of spouse or family, then you're able to become a US citizen, or it's a little bit easier for you to. And so he fled to California, and that's where he tried to reestablish himself and make his own life again. From what my mom said, she told him like he wasn't like a cool general. Like if you try to look up his name up, which is like Younghua, you won't be able to find him. But he was involved in the war. Whereas with my dad's side, it's a little bit more extensive. And so the fall of Saigon hit, and my dad's family didn't want to live underneath the communist regime, so they had to flee. And a common path for a lot of Vietnamese people to flee was by boat. And so my dad's family was made up of, let's see, let me count my hands. So 1, 2, 3. I'm just trying to figure out if I'm forgetting one. Okay. Okay, so 7 kids and 2 parents, so a family of 9. And at the time, it was extremely dangerous to travel as a large group. So instead, they sent out groups of their family to escape. And so at the time, the first group to escape was my dad, including his his older brother and his younger brother. And they escaped off into a refugee camp in Cambodia. And there they stayed there for quite some time because unless you know someone from the US, you probably aren't guaranteed to immigrate there. And so he had told me that he had stayed there for a year, and every day there would be these officials who would give everybody numbers, and they would do a little raffle, and whoever had the number would be able to immigrate there back to America. And so it wasn't until a year where they were finally lucky and they were able to immigrate to America. And so my dad and his 2 brothers were able to move to Texas. And there they had to figure out a way to get the rest of their family there. And so my dad and his brothers had to look for a sponsor. And that's how the rest of my family was able to get here because they were able to find a church that was able to sponsor the rest of their family. Meanwhile, the next group of my dad's family was my grandpa, my oldest aunt, and my uncle, and they also went into a refugee camp, but then they ended up in Canada. So that's where they are. And then the rest, which includes my grandmother and my younger two aunts, went into a refugee camp in Thailand. And so it was a big process of trying to find everybody, especially because they were scattered all over. And so my dad was able to find a church sponsor. And through that, he was able to bring his mom and his younger sisters to America. And it was a process after they were reunited. They then went through the process of trying to find the others, my aunt and my uncle, who were in Canada at the time. And that was the whole process of like looking through newspapers and everything, just asking around. And luckily they were able to be reunited, and then they all came together in Texas. And they lived there for several years, and then they moved to California where they resided for the